So welcome to the version of Jeff in the Box fully online lectures. So the starting point for this is to point out again that this is the ineffective forms of therapy. So I'm not even sure that most of these are effective for non-offenders, but certainly they're mostly inappropriate for offenders. The exception is we'll talk about a couple group therapies that, if you do it right, can still work. So the first sort of realm of therapy at the individual level is psychoanalysis. I'm guessing everybody's heard of this at some point in their life. That fellow there is Sigmund Freud. And you know, you can have a whole class on psychoanalysis in a bigger psych department. So and Freud wrote so extensively and so often contradicted himself that there's a lot of different ways to frame this theory. So I'm going to use the version that's in the Van Voris book and talk mostly about how it applies to therapy. Freud, the guiding principle of Freud was psychic determinism. So that's the belief that kind of everything you do, all your behaviors are motivated in your mind, whether conscious or unconscious. And to Freud, a lot of our actions and anxieties and worries were driven by sort of unconscious thoughts, wishes, desires, sort of deep-seated issues. And so that's sort of the starting point for Freud. Relevant to us are the elements of personality, because people who did try using his therapies did sort of focus on these building blocks. So if you've ever seen the cartoon angel, cartoon devil, they're in here. Right, so the cartoon devil would represent our id, and Freud sort of talked about these things as wishes. So you have id wishes and id desires, and those are the sort of basic, if it feels good, do it, sex, you know, alcohol and drugs, food, basic sort of wishes and desires of most human beings. And then the superego is sort of the angel, right? That's the ideal self, the golden rules that your parents have. Don't steal from others. Don't do anything that you would not want other people to do to you, and those sorts of things. And then in the cartoon, Homer here would represent the ego, trying to find some balance between the id and the superego wishes. And so that's the sort of thermostat that has to deal with the id wishes and navigate the world of superego rules. At least that's the gist of personality. In Freudian theory, Freud wrote a lot and talked a lot about anxiety, which is kind of one of the reasons it's not really a great therapy for offenders. They tend not to be anxious folks. And in the theory, anxiety can come from a variety of reasons. So back to here, right? Like as we grow up, most of us learn to sort of repress these basic id wishes and desires, or at least reframe them. And in Freudian theory, every time we repress something and push it down into our subconscious, it creates anxiety. And so one of the big contributions of Freud was that he talked about these mechanisms that reduce anxiety. And most of you are familiar with some of them. So projection, for example, would be to project your wishes, desires, feelings onto somebody else. So, you know, when you're angry and somebody says you're angry, like, I'm not angry, you're the one that's angry, right? You project your stuff onto somebody else. Rationalization is the bane of all professors and the sort of go-to of many students. So you do something, you feel anxious about it, and you rationalize your way out of it. So, well, I bombed the exam, but it wasn't my fault. The professor's an asshole. It was an unfair test, and so on and so forth. So again, they're important in Freudian theory as ways to reduce anxiety, and for the same reason, which I'll get to in a bit, they're important for criminology. It's one of the big contributions he's made that's lasted. In terms of explaining delinquency, a really good sort of exercise is to go through the Van Voris book and look at the stuff by Redl and Weinman. They actually created a camp for juvenile delinquents based on the principles of psychoanalysis. And so in there, they sort of list all the sort of contributions that the id, ego, and superego might make to delinquency. And so they talk about the possibility that somebody could have a sort of hyperactive id, right? That you just want stuff so bad that it overrides other stuff, but they think that, for some reason they thought that wasn't a real possibility, and so they focus on ego and superego. And you can get a sense, like if you read those things, there's some good stuff in there. The problem with this theory and the problem with a lot of therapy is you can't really see an id, ego, or superego, or measure them, or try to figure out how they work in that sense. And so if you read the statements and you sort of leave out, I can read a couple of them. They talk about, if I can find them. So they talk about ego failures. So again, the ego is supposed to navigate between the id and the superego. The delinquent ego cannot tolerate the emotions that accompany frustration. It insists upon total gratification of wishes. It cannot, in other words, control the wishes of the id. If you leave out the sort of psychoanalysis babble, nothing in there is controversial. In fact, it fits with most mainstream theories now, right? So if you just say the delinquent can't tolerate emotions that accompany frustration, they insist on gratification of wishes, and that's non-controversial. Most theories talk about frustration and the ability to deal with frustration. We would frame it now as sort of anger management. And you can go through the whole thing. They talk about a delinquent superego. Again, in Freudian theory, you sort of absorb your superego wishes from your parents when you identify with your parents. And they talk about the superego having peculiar values. The delinquent superego has identified with the delinquent code of behavior. The delinquent has internalized standards and values, but those are the standards and values of a delinquent subculture. Again, if you leave out the psychoanalysis stuff, that's part of social learning theory and other theories, is this belief that delinquents learn values that sort of support delinquency and crime. That's the basis of Sutherland's differential association theory. Point out Redl and Wyman ran a camp, and so like the issue becomes, well, how do you apply Freudian theory to delinquency? Freud himself spent a lot of time on psychoanalysis and trying to get in and delve into the unconscious wishes and desires and thoughts that people have. In that sense, he's the stereotype of somebody sitting on a couch getting analyzed. And the idea was, if you relax on a couch and you just talk and talk and talk and talk, what he would call free association, eventually you blurt out things that were sort of these deep-seated unconscious issues, wishes, anxieties. And that's the idea. And that's why this is sort of part of the insight-oriented. Like you get this this insight into something that was buried and you didn't realize it was there. And so if you ever heard the term Freudian slip, right? The idea is that it comes popping out without you thinking about it. To facilitate that, Freud did give his patients cocaine from time to time. He also analyzed dreams that he saw as a window into unconscious anxieties and such. So how do you run a camp like that? Well, if you look at sort of their camp, the three principles were provide a hygienic environment. In Freudian theory, a lot of anxieties and issues come from sort of trauma and mishandling as young children. So if you've ever heard the term anal retentive, that comes from Freudian theory about trying to potty train kids. And if that goes wrong, kids get essentially, be OCD. They get over compulsive about their cleanliness. And that's when you think about anal retentive people, they're sort of like neat freaks and they have to have everything just right. You provide a hygienic environment, you support the ego, which they did through recreation largely, playing games, these are young boys, and the exploitation of life events, which is still a part of most treatment now. Again, these are part of the sort of therapies that we figured out don't work for kids or adults. In fact, if psychoanalysis sort of works at all for anybody, it tends to work, as it says up here, with adult neurotics, anxious people who can talk out their problems. Delinquents tend to be young. They tend to be the opposite of neurotic. They tend to be sort of gregarious and outgoing and confident in who they are. And so most of the time, anxiety isn't an issue. Freudian therapy could last years, psychoanalysis could last years, and it was very expensive. So again, in a corrections environment, that's not such a good thing. So overall, not such a great therapy. As Van Voorhis and Salisbury point out, though, I mean, where it does sort of still strike a chord is crimes that don't have an obvious reason, right? So somebody shoplifts, you're like, well, why did they shoplift? And you say, well, they wanted stuff, but they wanted a thrill. And the Freudian therapist says, yes, but why did they really shoplift? And for most crimes, you're like, duh, there is no deep-seated reason. They just wanted stuff, and they wanted to impress their friends or whatever it was. But for some crimes, like, and the great example in the book is the sort of angry exhibitionist. It's a guy that has all sorts of problems going on in his life. His wife interrupted sex in the middle of sex and refused to continue and sort of berated him and mistreated him, and he got divorced, and so he ends up exposing himself. And you say, well, why do people expose their genitals out in society? And the Freudian analysis was, well, he regressed, right? Defense mechanism. He regressed back to an earlier stage in his life where it was pleasurable, where he did have his friend, and apparently his friend and himself exposed their genitals to each other. So, and as Van Voorhis points out, most offenders aren't anxious, but some are. And sometimes crime does have sort of deep-seated meaning that you need to dig into, and as opposed to the sort of very here and now orientation that most treatment has. Freudian theory, as I pointed out, is almost immeasurable, and it can be sort of changed to fit anything. In that sense, scientifically, it's not very valuable. And certainly psychoanalysis, the treatment that comes from the therapy, isn't very valuable for offenders. Having said that, it's still important, still worth talking about for two big reasons. One is a lot of the stuff from Freud, like I said with those scenarios, if you take out the Freudian babble and you read those little statements about delinquents, a lot of it makes sense, right? What Freud would call ego control, and ego and the ability to ego control id, we would just frame now as self-control, which you can measure, and you can study it scientifically, and it is important. What he calls defense mechanisms, we'll get into later, but we would now call those the pro-criminal attitudes, right? So people who rationalize all the time, they do it to relieve their guilt. And so in a sense, you're kind of reinforcing your criminal behavior by reducing that anxiety. It's a point that'll come up over and over again. And finally, like Freud also identified a fair number of techniques for the therapists that are still used and are still important. One of the big ones is transference, and that's the recognition that sometimes clients will use the therapist as sort of a stand-in for figures in the past. Like they'll start screaming at them as if the therapist were the dead. And that can be a sort of therapeutic thing if used right, but the therapist has to recognize that's happening and sort of capitalize on it. So the second sort of client-centered, insight-oriented therapy is what's called person-centered therapy. And so this is the Carl Rogers fellow that is trying to shrink the head of Gloria in the old 1960s video. And if you get up in the video, because it's sort of a lot of the same stuff over and over again, I go back at least watch the last clip, because the last clip is Carl Rogers talking about kind of what he thought went well, and what he thought worked, and he's talking a bit about sort of being genuine and congruent and so on and so forth. The gist of this theory is pretty simple. Rogers believed that people could essentially heal themselves if you just give them the right environment. And so he talked about, well, what's the right environment? And the role of the counselor here is to just be sort of empathetic and understanding, and no matter what the client says, you sort of treat it as positive, no matter what they say they've done. You don't look at them in a disgusted way. You don't sort of correct them. You're just genuine, and you sort of act in a very genuine, empathetic, positive way. And you get that from the Rogers stuff. He just... And a big part of it, that when you watch it, it's like he's not really adding much. He's just trying to provide this context that Gloria can eventually figure it out herself. And so a lot of it is sort of rephrasing so people can hear themselves. He said, what I hear you saying is this, and ooh, you sound like you're really anxious or you're really angry or whatever. and just trying to get people to recognize kind of how they're feeling. And so, again, in terms of does this work with offenders? No. This is like, offenders don't want to talk about necessarily what really causes crime. They will bring up sort of everything under the kitchen sink. They will tend to use this sort of therapy to blame other people, to sort of focus on the past, and so on and so forth. So person-centered therapy isn't really used much at all for anybody as just like, that's all we're going to do. It's still like the Freud on the couch. It is a stereotype. The therapist, well, how does that make you feel? And what do you think about that? But most therapists now are not that sort of mealy-mouthed, how does that make you feel? Most therapists provide a lot more guidance. They're more sort of Dr. Phil than they are Carl Rogers. That said, as with Freudian theory, there's sort of things to take from it. That sort of warmth and that establishing a relationship and those sorts of things are things that therapists are still trained to do. And the paraphrasing and that sort of stuff is still an important skill. So if you look at on page 87, this is sort of the big reason why it's not really appropriate for therapists. And they have two scenarios of a dude that comes home and ends up battering his wife or girlfriend, I can't remember. And the first is this person-centered dialogue. The guy starts this about he had a bad day at work and he comes home and he knew when he walked through the door his wife wasn't going to have dinner ready for him and so on and so forth, and he just lost it. And the counselor is just sort of, right, like you're supposed to do. Like, it sounds like you're angry and you're frustrated. It seems like you want your wife to be more attentive to you. And when you say that sort of stuff, in a way you're sort of supporting delinquent attitudes and pro-criminal attitudes, that their frustration justifies what they've done. And the good contrast, which we'll get to, is that cognitive behavioral dialogue that says, no, look, I don't care what kind of day you have. The starting point is that hitting another person like that is wrong, and it doesn't really matter how you justify it. So the cognitive therapy is much more confrontational and much more sort of here and now oriented, and that's why it tends to work better. There are, and reality therapy is kind of the polar opposite of the ones we're talking about. These are the person-centered and the Freudian are what Van Boris and Salisbury say are basically under-confrontational. They just kind of let the client feel around and explore what they want to explore. And this one tended to be a reality therapy. It reminds me of the movie What About Bob, where he's talking about death therapy. Reality therapy is actually not that far off from modern cognitive behavioral therapy. It's sort of the 60s, right before Albert Ellis sort of latched onto this cognitive stuff. But, the sort of here and now and rejecting any negative pro-criminal attitudes, the reality part, and this is also very similar to that creative correction stuff we talked about earlier, was that this belief that everybody has wants and desires and needs, and to meet those needs, that people have to be realistic. They have to see the true consequences of their behavior. They have to be sort of able to be critical of themselves. And so the person here takes on a much more aggressive role and a much more challenging role. And we'll see this, like I said, the importance of this is mostly just a precursor for the cognitive stuff. All right, the last sort of section of theories, they mix kind of two things together. And I think what I'm going to do is end this, and we'll make two videos in case something goes horribly wrong with the group therapy.